and established the precedents in international law that the United Nations has the right to pass a resolution and send a police force to enforce that resolution on what used to be sovereign nations answerable only to themselves, and thus destroyed the concept in international law forever of the sovereignty of nations. Unless we're smart enough and strong enough to reestablish our sovereignty and our Constitution. The real reason the Shah of Iran was overthrown was that his best efforts to institute clean programs of birth control failed to make a significant dent in the country's birth rate. The promise of jobs through an ambitious industrialization program encouraged migration toward overcrowded cities like Tehran. Under Ayatollah Khomeini, the clean programs have been dismantled, and the Ayatollah executed hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of people. The government may make progress because it has a program, quote, to induce up to half of Tehran's 6 million residents to relocate. Iran's war with Iraq really pleased the OPA, unquote. Now you know about the Shah, now you know part of the reason we have troops in the Middle East. President Marcos fell victim to the same policy. If you really believed that Corazon Aquino overthrew Fernando Marcos, you're playing poker with a bad hand. In fact, half your deck is missing. Daniel B. Luton had this to say, quote, an organization cannot have a conservation policy without having a population policy, the sanity test, in which the candidate confronted with an overflowing sink is classified according to whether he reaches for the mop or for the faucet. For the mop or for the faucet, unquote. Think about it. Civilians are killed in El Salvador's civil war each year. To accomplish what the State Department deems adequate population control, the Civil War would have to be greatly expanded, according to Thomas Ferguson, the Latin American case officer for the OPA. El Salvador was targeted for population control and war in an April 1980 population report published by the National Security Council. El Salvador is an example of a country with serious population and political problems, the report states. Rapid population growth, the birth rate, has remained unchanged in recent years, and it aggravates its population density, which is already the highest on mainland Latin America. While a population program exists on paper, it has not been pursued with a strong commitment, and contraceptives remain unavailable. The population program really did not work, OPA's Ferguson said. The infrastructure was not there to support it. There were just too many goddamn people. If you want to control a country, you have to keep the population down. Too many people breed social unrest and communism, unquote. I'm quoting Mr. Ferguson. Again, quote, something had to be done, unquote, the OPA official said. The birth rate is 3.3%, one of the highest in the world. Its population, he complained, will double in 21 years. In 21 years. Quote, the Civil War can help things, but it would have to be greatly expanded, unquote. In making sure that the population falls in El Salvador, Ferguson said, the OPA has learned a lot from its experiences in Vietnam. Quote, we studied the thing. That area was also overpopulated and a problem. We thought that the war would lower population, and we were wrong, unquote. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you know one of the reasons of what we were really doing in Vietnam and why we were not allowed to win that war. According to Ferguson, the population in Vietnam increased during the war despite United States use of defoliation and a combat strategy that encouraged civilian casualties. And now you also know why those of us in the know consider Lieutenant Calley to be a scapegoat. He was ordered to do what he did, does not excuse the fact that he carried out that order. But those above him skated away scot-free because you just couldn't believe that such a thing could have been ordered. Shame on you. To reduce population quickly, said Ferguson, you have to pull all the males into the fighting and kill significant numbers of fertile childbearing age females. That's a direct quote. He criticized the current civil war in El Salvador. And he said this, you are killing a small number of males and not enough fertile females to do the job on the population. If the war went on 30 to 40 years like this, then you might accomplish something. Unfortunately, we don't have too many instances like that to study. I'm going to give you some information, folks, to aid you in your research of this travesty. The names of the significant reports are, and write these down. Write these down. I hope you're taping this program, as you should be taping every single episode of the Hour of the Time. The only hour that ever was or ever will be, or that ever is, the hour during which you're going to decide your future, and thus our collective futures. Write this down. The names of the significant reports are, number 1, The Population Bomb by Dr. Paul R. Ehrlich. Dr. Ehrlich's wife, Anne, is a member of the Club of Rome, and that's why you continue to see Dr. Ehrlich and his wife, Anne, in documentaries on the public PBS TV stations and on public radio touting population control. They were in it from the first. Number 2, the Global 2000 Report to the President, signed by President Carter. And number 3, The Limits to Growth, a report for the Club of Rome's project on the predicament of mankind. Let me go over that once more for you. The Population Bomb by Dr. Paul R. Ehrlich. It's spelled E-H-R-L-I-C-H. Number 2, the Global 2000 Report to the President, a very thick report signed by President Carter. And number 3, The Limits to Growth, which was a report for the Club of Rome's project on the predicament of mankind. In April 1968, the study began publicly in the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome, Italy. The study had been ongoing in secret ever since the initial findings of the Huntsville meeting in 1957. They met at the instigation of Dr. Aurelio Pacheco. The first real public indication of their findings and the solution that had been decided upon was publication of the book called The Population Bomb in May of 1968. Notice how close the dates are. On page 17 of The Population Bomb, a telling paragraph reveals all that there is to know. Listen very carefully. Quote, in summary, the world's population will continue to grow as long as the birth rate exceeds the death rate. It's as simple as that. When it stops growing or starts to shrink, It will mean that either the birth rate has gone down or the death rate has gone up, or a combination of the two. Basically, then, there are only two kinds of solutions to the population problem. One is a birth rate solution, in which we find ways to lower the birth rate. The other is a death rate solution, in which ways to raise the death rate, war, famine, pestilence, find us. Listen to this last sentence, because this is the one that tells you what the decision was. Quote, "The population could have been avoided by population control, in which mankind consciously adjusted the birth rate so that a death rate solution did not have to occur." That is a confession telling you that their decision was that the lowering of the birth rate was not successful, and that they had to increase the death rate. The recommendations of the results of the study were made by Dr. Aurelio Pachetti, who pledged not to use the prophylactic and not to take the cure should the microbe be developed and should he contract the disease. Dr. Pachetti was considered a hero for deciding to take the same risk as the general population when he did not have to. The public results of the study were published in 1968 and again in 1972. The MIT project team members from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology that developed the computer model study are as follows. Dr. Dennis L. Meadows, Director, United States. Dr. Allison A. Anderson, United States, on population. Dr. J. M. Anderson, United States, also on population. Ilyas Bayer, Turkey, agriculture. William W. Behrens III, United States, resources. Farhad Hakimzadeh, Iran, population. Dr. Stephen Harbort, Germany, socio-political trends. Wouldn't you know they'd put a German in to represent socio-political trends? Judith A. Machen, United States Administration. Dr. Danella H. Meadows, United States Population. Peter Milling, Germany, capital. For those of you who don't understand capital, it means money. Nirmala S. Murphy, India, population. Roger F. Nail, United States, resources. Jorgen Randers, Norway, population. Stephen Chances, United States, agriculture. John A. Seeger, United States, administration. Marilyn Williams, United States, documentation. Dr. Eric K. O. Zahn, Germany, agriculture. You see, folks, you don't hear this anywhere else, and you're never going to hear it anywhere else, and I name names, and I know what I'm talking about. As Pogo once said, I have found the enemy, and he is us. When the study was completed in 1969, the United Nations Secretary General U Thant of the United Nations made this statement. Quote, "I do not wish to seem overdramatic, but I can only conclude from the information that is available to me as Secretary General that the members of the United Nations have perhaps 10 years left in which to subordinate their ancient quarrels and launch a global partnership to curb the arms race, to defuse the population explosion, and to supply the required momentum to develop efforts. If such a global partnership is not forged within the next decade, then I very much fear that the problems I have mentioned will have reached such staggering proportions that they will be beyond our capacity to control." Unquote. Project MK Naomi was developed by the Special Operations Division, scientists at Fort Detrick, Maryland, under the supervision of the Central Intelligence Agency. A reference to the Project MK